Welcome to the Unwashed Asses, episode 136, recorded for Monday, December 2nd, 2019. The yearly reading festival continues as I finally finished another book. Really trying hard to get as many of these done because, again, I feel like I don't read as much and I just spend a lot of my time on the internet looking at pointless bullshit when I could be better cultivating my mind and hopefully improving my attention span. So if you find yourself kind of meandering and not really grasping onto things, try reading a book. It has been surprisingly helpful to me in that regard. This latest tale we read was The King in Yellow, written by... I apologize here, I'm on my phone, so swapping between things won't be as quick, but you won't hear me clicking. Written by Robert W. Chambers and published in 1895. I had heard about this one on a podcast. It was either Stuff They Don't Want You to Know or damn it, I'm terrible with names, I'm sorry. No, I know what it was. It was, man, this is just bad all around. I apologize. Stuff You Should Know podcast. They were talking about, the true stories or the, truth behind True Detective and what had inspired it. And a lot of it was dealing with, cults. But one of the inspirations was this collection of short stories written by, again, Robert W. Chambers, called The King in Yellow. And as soon as they mentioned, it had ties into, supernatural horror and cosmic horror, and was a big inspiration for Lovecraft. Even though I'm not a fan of Lovecraft's writing, I like the stories behind them, if that makes sense. I like the themes and what he's trying to do. I just don't like the way he's doing it. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm on board. Let me head over to the Kindle store and download a copy. And so the version I had obtained is actually just 4 short stories, where the original had the 4 short stories pertaining to the play The King in Yellow. There are also a collection of poems and prose that followed after. So I don't have that version. I can't comment on those, and as such, we're going to be sticking primarily to the 4 short stories revolving around the titular play, The King in Yellow. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about Mr. Chambers himself. Robert William Chambers was born in May 1865, lived until 1933, started his career as an artist. He was educated at the Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute and had several pieces displayed all over the world, in the U.S., Paris. He did illustrations for several magazines, including Life, Truth, and Vogue. But for reasons that aren't entirely his career over to writing. He wrote his first novel, In the Quarter, in 1887, and then had released The King in Yellow shortly thereafter in 1895. Now, The King in Yellow, again, is primarily dealing with supernatural horror, and has elements of just outright either cosmic horror or there's a lot of religious symbology here going on, but it's all about super scared narrators telling their stories. And if you've read Lovecraft, that's going to be very, very familiar. It's almost like Lovecraft said, oh, I like this is what I'm going to write exclusively. But Chambers kind of changed track, when he moved from more traditional art like paintings and drawings into writing. He shifted gears with his writing and got away from the horror and moved more into romance novels. And also during World War I, he wrote several war stories. One of the more notable novels he had was The Man They Hanged, which argued that the famous Captain Kidd, was not a pirate but had been made a scapegoat by the British government. So he had a lot of stuff going on, and had a very successful career, and according to Wikipedia here, was one of the more successful authors of his time. That being said, his legacy is kind of tainted in the fact that while he did have this big, robust catalog of work available, the thing he is most remembered for is the King in Yellow, and that's largely due to Lovecraft's infatuation with it and his doing a critical study of horror and basing a lot of it around this work. Now, with that all being said, let's get into the stories themselves. So, the version that I have contains 4 stories. The Repair of Reparations, The Mask, In the Court of the Dragon, and The Yellow Sign. The other stories contained in other versions or other publications of the work include I don't speak French. The Demoiselles D's, The Prophet's Paradise, The Street of the Four Winds, The Street of the First Shell, The Street of Our Lady of the Fields, a lot of streets, and Rue Barry. But The King in Yellow is a play that is a central theme to the first 4 stories and is largely touted by the characters in each short story to drive the reader insane should they lay eyes upon it. It will drive them to utter madness. Now, we don't actually get to read the play in its entirety, but there are excerpts prefacing each story, and then the characters themselves, particularly in the Repair of Reputations, will call back to the story itself and regale us with what they have read in the book or make allusions to how it plays into real life. Because while it is reportedly a work of fiction, several characters actually believe them to be true, and that is either a case of delusions on their part or being made to convince it after reading the story itself. But we do have some excerpts here. So, Casilda's song, which comes from Act 1, Scene 2 of the play, goes as such. Along the shore, the cloud waves break. The twin suns sink behind the lake. The shadows lengthen in Carcosa. Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle through the skies. But stranger still is lost Carcosa. Songs that the Hades shall sing, where flap the tatters of the king, must die unheard in dim Carcosa. Song of my soul, my voice is dead. Die thou, unsung, as tears unshed, shall dry and die in lost Carcosa. Then we get some weird bits where it's clearly a story about this supernatural entity, the King in Yellow, who, as we see in stories like in the Court of the Dragon, will stalk his prey and induce terror in his victim before finally doing whatever he does. Much like Lovecraft, there's a lot of teasing, there's a lot of build-up. On Twitter, I compared it to, you get a solid hour of foreplay, and then when it's time to get into the action, it's over before you know it, and you're left ultimately unsatisfied. So what we have here, The Mask, is an excerpt from Act 1, Scene 2, D. Camilla, you, sir, should unmask. Stranger, indeed. Casilda, indeed, it's time. We have all laid aside disguise, but you. Stranger, I wear no mask. Camilla, terrified, aside to Casilda. No mask, no mask! It's also stated, though, that in the Repair of Reputations. Then the final moment of the first act, it involves Casilda, the character we had just heard about there, on the streets, screaming in a horrified fashion, "Not upon us, O king, not upon us!" In quoting here from Wikipedia, all the excerpts come from Act 1. The stories describe Act 1 as quite ordinary, but reading Act 2 drives the reader mad with the irresistible revealed truths. Quote, "The very banality and innocence of the first act only allowed the blow to fall afterward with more awful effect." End quote. Even seeing the first page of the second act is enough to draw the reader in. Quote, "If I had not caught a glimpse of the opening words in the second act, I should never have finished it." End quote, in the Repair of Reputations. What we then have here is author. Chambers usually gives only scattered hints of the contents of the full play, as in this extract from the Repair of Reputations. Quote, "He mentioned the establishment of the dynasty in Carcosa, the lakes which connected Hester, Aldebaran, and the mystery of the Hyades. He spoke of Casilda and Camilla, and sounded the cloudy depths of Demi, and the lake." Quote, "The scallop tatters of the king in yellow must hide Yatil forever." End quote. He muttered, "But I do not believe Vance heard him." Then by degrees he led Vance along the ramifications of the imperial family to Uoht, and Thale, from Nautalba and Phantom of Truth to Aldona's, and then tossing aside his manuscript and notes, he began the wonderful story of the last king. End quote. A similar passage occurs in The Yellow Sign, in which two protagonists have read The King in Yellow. Quote, "Night fell and the hours dragged on, but still we murmured to each other of the king in the pallid mask, and midnight sounded from the misty spires of the fog-wrapped city. We spoke of Hester and of Casilda, while outside the fog rolled against the blank window panes as the cloud waves roll and break on the shores of Holly." End quote. So, what we have here is a story that, again, drives the reader mad, but plays a large centerpiece in that the idea behind it is that such a work is, the play The King in Yellow is beautiful and profound and a magical experience, but it is also blasphemous in the terror that it inflicts upon the reader itself. So everybody knows about it, but everybody doesn't want to read it. And in fact, in the story The Yellow Sign, the artist has a copy of the book. He doesn't know how he got it, but he doesn't want to read it. And then we find by the end of it, his lady love has read it, he's read it, and it's almost like they're induced in this sort of trance. And now he's wearing the mark of the Yellow King, which signs him for death. And there's just a lot of stuff happening with it. And I guess that's one of the things that I did enjoy about it, is that all four stories are connected not only by the Yellow King, but also by other properties. In the Repair of Reputations, we have the statue of the three fates standing before the suicide booth. And then we learn that the artist who had made it had died shortly thereafter, I think the age of 23. And in the very next story, The Mask, it's a story about that artist. And he's actually making the piece, which kind of acted in a way of spoilers that we know, oh, well, he's been laid out as being 23 at the start of his own story. He's not going to live to see the end of it. So I almost feel like it would have been rearranged better to have read The Mask first instead of the Repair of Reputations. But overall, it's a good bit of world building, and it makes you feel that while there are inconsistencies due to mostly the unreliable narrator aspect, this is a rich, breathing world full of life and people and, objectively terror as they try to navigate the world after being succumbed to the terror that is the King in Yellow. And we don't really, again, get much interaction with said fabled king, aside from what potentially might be an encounter in the third story In the Court of the Dragon, which is maybe the shortest story of the four, and deals with a man who goes to church and is now stalked by the piano organist who, spoilers, by the end of the story is potentially revealed to be the King in Yellow. But the story itself is and this is where I have problems with stories like this in Lovecraft's work, is it seems very, very banal. It's not intimidating, and I have to kind of preface it with the idea that these works are 100 years old, and what scares me now is definitely not what would scare, I'd like to think that as time has marched on, our tastes and art have matured and only built one upon the other, and that today's works of horror would just absolutely shock and appall and terrify people from 100 years ago, whereas their definition of horror is the building blocks for our horror, and as such it is predictable, it is very meager in its offerings. It lays but doesn't really execute further upon that, and in this case in the Court of the Dragon story is mostly just a story of stalking and the fear of what may happen versus what actually happens. And while yes, you do let the reader run with their imagination, and that is more let them do the work for you, essentially, ultimately, because we have so much titillation happening before the fact and then no real payoff, it leaves you wanting more and just disappointed in what was itself laid out. That being said, though, there are still some tremendous stories, and in fact, the one that has the least horror elements of it, the Mask, was a delightful read. I loved it. It was a story about young lovers and living in Paris as artists, and was just an absolute treat. It was probably my favorite of the four. The Repair of Reputations, and I've mentioned this before, introduces the idea of an unreliable narrator, and it's something that, again, it's not obvious, it doesn't smack you over the head, but as you go further and further into this story, you start to get that impression that, oh, maybe this guy's not quite right in the head, and maybe what he's telling me, like of this, again, this book was written in 1895. We're presented with a futuristic version of America in the 1920s, where the taint of the Jews has been eradicated, immigrants are under control, and we have a more imperialistic army, and we now have suicide booths, and we're denouncing those with other opinions, and almost like it's a stark, mirror of reality. I don't know. I tried to get political. It doesn't work. That's why I don't do it. But it makes you wonder if those things that he's telling the reader about are actually there, or if they are his delusions, because the idea is that he is bound for a much greater destiny and is doing these terrible things. And the idea of him being essentially the king of the world, and that his friend who manages reputations has essentially secret control of the world and is ready to hand it over to the one true king, the last descendant of the Yellow King, or the King in Yellow. It's an interesting concept to play with, and I think it would be a wonderful movie in that you could have a more Memento effect, where you watch the movie through once, and once the hook has been revealed, it would be an interesting story to go back and watch again, knowing what's happened, or trying to see through the illusion itself. So I guess in that regard, the book itself was relatively inexpensive on the Kindle store, and I like what it was trying to tell. I didn't necessarily care for the execution, but it held my attention. And I think that what helps with that is that they are short stories. Now, the lengths vary between all four of them, but they're all very engrossing reads. There wasn't a point where I was sitting there wanting to, essentially crack the whip and get things moving along, like I am reading the picture of Dorian Gray. It's like, come on, get things going. Like, it has a good pace. It doesn't lull, it doesn't speed too much except towards the end, but that's just emblematic of writing at the time. So, a little late for Halloween, but if you want a good taste of some supernatural horror, go give Mr. Robert Chambers' book, The King in Yellow, a read. But that's going to wrap this one up. If you have your own thoughts, concerns, criticisms, critiques, complaints, or just want to shoot the shit about your favorite writer, drop an email over to theunwashedasses@gmail.com. Again, theunwashedasses@gmail.com. And don't forget, we have a store. Head over to bit.ly/0and09 store. Links in the show notes. Grab yourself a shirt, some stickers, or maybe a fancy print of my Trey excellent photography. But that's going to wrap it up here. We will talk to you next week. But until then, blood for the blood god.